Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm the director of the Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth College. This afternoon, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, William Fischel, my colleague in the economics department, who is the Patricia F. and William B. Hale 1944 Professor in Arts and Sciences. He is one of the world's leading experts on local public finance and the author of a new book, Making the Grade, The Economic Evolution of American School Districts, published by the University of Chicago Press. Today's lecture will focus on the consolidation of school districts in the 20th century, its root causes, and their implications for the efficiency and equity of public schooling in America going forward. Professor Fischel's scholarly work is focused on regulatory takings and on the economics of local government, especially the Thibault hypothesis, zoning, and property taxation. He was the organizer of a conference hosted by the Rockefeller Center, the Thibault Model at 50, the proceedings of which were published by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in 2006. His other recent book, The Home Voter Hypothesis, was published by the Harvard University Press in 2001 and is a standard reference for those interested in the way local public finance affects public policy outcomes. His two prior books were titled The Economics of Zoning Laws and Regulatory Takings. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor William Fischel.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very pleased to do that. I've got to make sure this works by patting it right. That's the way I'm supposed to do it. I've sort of always wanted to do this. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, help me. I want to do this kind of like an economics seminar, and economics seminars are filled with economists, and economists are rude. They just ask questions whenever they feel like it. So what I would like you to do is ask a question whenever you feel like it. If you want to raise your hand and I'll recognize you, that's fine. But if you would just want to shout it out. There are kind of two kinds of questions on the other hand. One is the official, you forgot to explain what year this map was drawn. This should be off, shouldn't it? I'm looking at somebody who... Should this be on? Should both mics be on?
I don't think they are.
Okay. Right. I see a green light, that's all. One is the explanatory questions, where you'd like me to explain a little bit more of what I'm saying. The other is the alternative thesis. I think you're entirely wrong. And here's where I'd like you to behave a little more politely and push it to the back of the presentation when I'm done with my presentation, such as it is here. So that's sort of the ground rules. All right. I have a slide here that kind of summarizes what I want to say, actually more than I want to say about this topic. This is a book that I've been writing for a long time. And I got to writing it because when I got done writing the home voter hypothesis about local governments and about how local government is essentially governed by people who are concerned about the value of their homes, I lumped school districts and municipalities all in the same boat. And so I thought, well, school district, municipality, they're pretty much the same, even though I knew there were different government structures and so forth. And after a while, after I wrote this, even as I was writing the home voter hypothesis, it dawned on me, school districts are kind of different. In New England, they do match up with the local government boundaries, but in the rest of the country, they scatter all over the place. They don't necessarily correspond with a local government boundary. So maybe I ought to take a closer look at school districts. In taking a closer look at school districts, I discovered that nobody really had a very good explanation, or indeed any explanation at all, for why we have the boundaries and the configuration of school districts we have in the United States. And so I necessarily started doing some history of school districts, and which of course are related to public education generally. And I discovered that the history of school districts is dominated by a conventional story, which I will call the top-down or the supply-side history. And so I briefly want to go through this top-down supply-side history. This is a bit of a straw person. That is, it doesn't accurately characterize any the thoughts of any education historian. But I would say that I would get majority assent on most of these points from education historians. So the education historians' view of the evolution of school districts and public schools generally in the United States was, if we divide this into 2 centuries, and I know there is a pre-19th century, indeed we'll talk a little bit about the pre-19th century in a minute here. The 19th century one-room schools, this is the supply side story. They're nice and homey and uniform. Everybody's nostalgic for those one-room rural schools where most people actually did go to school. You have to remember that in the 19th century, particularly the early part of the 19th century, the United States is a rural country. In 1800, 90 to 95% of all workers worked on farms. It was a very, and even as late as 1880, about half of the population lived on farms. So the 19th century one-room schools are nice and homey. They're uniform. We have this common school revival. Horace Mann helped make them all into uniform. But they're kind of inefficient because they're really too small to teach things correctly. The teachers who are teaching them don't have much formal education. And indeed, that is correct. They did not have much formal education. These schools were transformed into the 20th century multi-grade schools. They were transformed by, and here the education history story varies a bit. The early 20th century education historians like Elwood Patterson Cubberley, the founder and first dean of the Stanford School of Education back in 1917, thought of this as an enlightened event. The latter part of the 20th century, perhaps signified by Michael Katz, who said that really these were sort of self-serving bureaucrats and capitalist interests who wanted to have a passive labor force. Anyways, the education establishment that transforms the one-room schools into the 20th century's multi-grade schools, which are nice and professional and uniform, but they're locally alienating because they are basically creatures of the state. The state government really does things. The local control is a myth, is something not very important to people. Okay, so I've set up the straw man. There are many elements of truth to the straw man to the left side there. I am not denying elements of truth of this. There is a supply side story that's important. But entirely neglected, almost entirely neglected in this history, is what I would call the demand side history of the transformation of schools from their one-room dominance to regular schools. My view of one-room schools is that they are harsh and variable, but actually efficient. 19th century one-room schools were not fun. They were drafty old shacks, and the method of teaching was basically rote memorization. And if you didn't memorize properly, you got swatted or humiliated. This was not a pleasant kind of experience for the most part. They were quite variable. They had a similar kind of curriculum, but some met for 2 months a year, some might meet for 5 months a year. Terms were quite irregular. I argue, however, that this was efficient because it actually responded to the needs of a rural population that did not have much transportation and needed a lot of child labor, or at least adolescent labor, to run their farms. And so this was I call this an adaptive technology. This is a story. Although you won't see anything looking like engineering here, this is a story about technological change. One-room schools really did run things differently, and I want to impress that upon people about how different one-room schools of the 19th century, they were different from the one-room schools of the 20th century as well, by the way. So a lot of people's ideas about one-room schools are recollections from the 1920s, where the one-room schools are trying to imitate the multi-graded schools, the multi-age graded schools. Not terribly successfully, but they're trying to do this. Back in the one-room school, they did not have grades. That's the story here of making the grade. There's actually 2 connotations to this kind of, it's something of a double entendre, in other words. and actually it has nothing to do with grades of A, B, or C. The grade that I'm talking about here is the grade of education starting with grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade school in other words, rather than grades of A, B, C, or D in this. And there's a technological change that goes on here. The transformation, in my view, is not the bureaucratic education establishment. Again, I don't discount them entirely, but they really couldn't do anything until the local voters were interested in transforming their schools from these one-room schools to the multi-graded schools. And the interest for them were two. One was, in the 20th century, high school education becomes very important. High school education is not terribly important in the 19th century. The skills you acquired in high school were were for an elite that might want to go into the ministry or something like to prepare you to go to college. You might go to an academy. It really wasn't a high school before 1870 in the sense that we understand it. Come about 1900, 1910, and Claudia Golden and Larry Katz have a book about this, the high school, how high school really transformed the 20th century education in the United States. The transformation I'm talking about, I take this transformation as given that high school had a big payoff, a big economic payoff. People wanted their kids to be able to get into high school, and the one-room school was not up to the task. And so property-owning local voters changed their minds about loving their one-room school. They liked their one-room school. They were community builders in a very important sense. But they were also concerned about their property values, and people who were shopping around, doing this kind of Tebow shopping trip, who were shopping around from one place to another, looking for a place, would not move in, or with good preference, would not move into an area that did not prepare their children to get into high school. And so the one-room school essentially was reluctantly given up by local property owners who said, nobody wants to live on my farm, nobody wants to buy my house, nobody wants to come and work for my business if the schools aren't decent around here. My wife Janice, who's in the audience, pointed out a story that I think it was in the Valley News. There's actually about people looking around for school districts. Even people without children were really interested in the quality of school districts. I'm claiming that went way back. That's been going on for hundreds of years, not just currently. So the local voters are instrumental because the quality of the school is reflected in their property values. And they transformed these schools into these, they then accepted what the suppliers were doing, wanted to do. They wanted to do it for a long time. They couldn't do it until the local voters would accept it. Almost all of these transformations I'm talking about, the consolidation of schools, was the product, had to be approved by local voters. Lots of plans were rejected, and only when the suppliers of the education establishment presented them with something they were interested in that would actually enhance the attractiveness of their property, would they go for the schools. My view of the 20th century multi-grade schools is that I share that with the other side of the story, but I also think that 20th century schools, we mistakenly look at the role of the school board and how it coordinates with the state education establishment. And indeed, if you get elected to a school board, your first lecture you will get is pay attention to what the superintendent tells you to do. My view is that the school district now is very important to people, even people who don't have children's schools, because the schools are a real locus of social capital. That's how you get to know people in your community outside of your job. You have kids, your kids meet other kids, you, for good Darwinian reasons, want to find out about the parents of those kids, and that's how you get to know people in your community. You, even if you don't have kids, will be better connected in that community if you know the people next door. We have a family of 5 school-age children next door, well, 4 school-age children next door. We know a lot of people as a result of that, even though our son has been out of school for quite a while now. So I think this is the the locus of social capital, and that's what makes them important. Okay, I'm going to kind of go through the slides, and I think we have a handout that everybody got. The only reason I gave you the handout was because I'm not technophobic, but I'm techno challenged, and I can goof up at any time. So this is basically your backup. But if you want to look at the handout, it's the same that I'm showing up here. I may be able to get in closer up here, though. This is a map of the school districts in the 48 United States in the year 2000. There's a lot of them. There are a lot more school districts than there are almost any other local government. There are about 3,000 counties, a little more than 3,000 counties. There's about maybe 10,000 cities. And of course, there's lots of little special districts and so forth. But school districts are quite numerous. And the two things I want to mention about this map, the one is not particularly visible and the other is pretty visible. The thing that's not particularly visible is that school districts match up, as I mentioned before, with municipal boundaries largely in New England and, for some reason, New Jersey. New Jersey townships and boroughs are all their own school district. Likewise, in New England, almost every town of any size, and by of any size doesn't have to be very big size, more than, I think like 700 people or something like that, will have its own elementary school and be its own school district. The boundaries of the town and the boundaries of the school district are pretty much the same. Even when the school districts consolidate to have a regional school, it will be the entire town that joins. It won't be part of a town in one school district and part of a town in another district. Outside of New England, on the other hand, in Illinois, for example, or Ohio or Michigan, the school district and the town boundaries run all over the place. They very often do not correspond. The one big exception, and the one reason this is sort of news to people, is the big cities are very often the big old cities are very often their own school district. So New York City is its own school district. So is Boston, but of course it's a New England town. Chicago is its own school district. I think it's the only city in Illinois that's its own school district, where the boundaries of the city and the school district perfectly correspond. So big old central cities are really the only places where the mayor can take over the school district. In most other cities, and including Los Angeles, this was actually a controversial issue a few years ago, the mayor of Los Angeles say, hey, I can run the schools just as well as the mayor of New York can. The problem is that the Los Angeles Unified School District does not correspond to the boundaries of the city of Los Angeles. All of Los Angeles is in the district, but it also includes a bunch of other stuff. And the one person, one vote rule sort of precludes the mayor from that particular takeover. So they did try and sort of get around this, but it actually failed. The courts said that this was unconstitutional. I'm not sure whether it was on the one person, one vote rule, but in Los Angeles it was actually shut down. So school districts and cities outside the rest of the country do not necessarily correspond in their boundaries. However, I will say that for the most part, cities of any size will generally will have some correspondence. I actually developed a measure of this and spent a good part of the summer looking at the maps on Google Earth. This is a discovery that a lot of people actually don't know, and it is news to a lot of researchers in this area. Google Earth will, in a subcategory that they actually is completely non-revealing of what's in it, will show you municipal boundaries, they're in yellow, and school district boundaries, whether it's an elementary or a high school or a unified school district. It will show you the boundaries, and you can then juxtapose them one upon the other. And so you can actually get a good sense of how closely cities and school districts correspond. And I would say about 2/3 of the population of sizable cities more than 25,000, correspond not perfectly, but approximately with their own school district. So when you talk a city having its school district, it's usually a district that it sort of corresponds with. Some of the district might be in another city or an unincorporated area. The other big thing you see here are there are areas of great density of school districts, chiefly the north, the Mississippi Valley, or west of the Mississippi, that is, and the urban, or the what I would call the well-irrigated and sometimes rainy west coast, have lots and lots of school districts. Those black splotches you see up there are pixels that are where the districts are so small, and it's not tiny, so small they fit closer together. So I have an explanation for this variation in geography. This is kind of obvious. Not a lot of people there in the central, in the Great Basin desert, and so the school district has to be quite large. Nevada sensibly, I guess sensibly, made counties into their school districts counties. Utah did it for most of its counties outside of the Salt Lake area where there are some city school districts. Salt Lake is its own school district, and as is Murray and some of the other cities. But basically, this is lack of kids per square mile, so they have to have a large school district. The peculiar, and so the other thing that's different here is the South. The South is not an arid place. In fact, it's the wettest place around, and the rural population density was quite high early in the century. But the South is basically organized into county school districts. The county line makes a lot of difference in the South. I think that that's for two reasons why the South is different from the North, which you only think about if you think about this bottom-up story that I have of demand. The South has large school districts for two reasons. One is there are real diseconomies to running segregated schools. You have to have not just two sets of schools, two sets of buses, two sets of textbooks, two sets of teachers, two sets of administrators, even, this one always blew me away, two sets of textbook storage facilities. They couldn't put the white and the black textbooks in the same building. Whew. Terrible, at least that surprised me. So there's a diseconomy. You have to have a big district. The South, in effect, made itself like the arid West in terms of its density by having two. The other was the South did not want to have a lot of small local governments because that would mean that blacks would be a majority somewhere. So they had to have the county, which is an agent of the state, run the schools, and very often the county superintendent and the county school board would be appointed by the governor or the legislature or something like that. Indeed, the South really didn't get onto the graded school norm that I'm going to talk about until around 1900, when they decided to get out of the one-room schools. They didn't want to pay for the black schools, so they disfranchised all the blacks, and that would allow them to have some local government. The problem with disfranchising blacks is you disfranchised a lot of poor whites, so that local government everywhere, even though it was now allowed to run their schools, was really an elite kind of local government, and the county remained as the school district in the South. Another way of leaving this map here, of saying this, is the supply side story sounds more sensible if you're talking about the South. That is the top-down story. And it's top-down because the South is afraid of the voters. They're afraid of those poor whites. They're afraid of all blacks. And so they want to do things from the county on down. And you get fairly explicit statements about this, by the way. This is not my inference. Let's look at the second slide that I wanted to talk about. And this is kind of the thing that Andrew mentioned of the consolidation of schools. This is this is a figure of one-room schools, 1916 to 1984. The round dots are the one-room schools. And the school districts, this is all for the entire United States, and it starts in 1938. There's no previous series. The series actually starts in 1938. Take two things away from this. One is there's an enormous number of one-room schools. back in 1916 when this starts, almost 200,000. Before that, the counting is kind of sketchy, and you can imagine the government trying to actually count all this stuff. It actually didn't have very good statistics on it. Probably in 1890, 1900, there may have been 250,000 one-room schools. It was the school, period, for most places outside of the larger cities. And remember, most people live outside of larger cities. This is not an urban society back here. We get to an urban society around 1930. The other thing to take away is that every one-room school, almost every one-room school back then was its own school district. So what's going on here is the schools, as the one-room school goes out of business, the school districts decline in number to the 15,000 mark or so that we see around now. And pretty much the number of school districts is going down at the same rate that one-room schools go down. And in 1972, when one-room schools are statistically extinct, district consolidation stops. Almost all of this consolidation is one-room schools. And I have some other data to demonstrate this that lend themselves to less clear text. So in one sense, what I'm trying to do is explain the hockey stick. Kind of looks like the double-bladed hockey stick here. The blade down here and the shaft coming down. Why did this happen? What was going on? The top-down story said the state made them do it. The demand-side story, my story, says the voters got religion, got the consolidated school district, consolidated school and school district belief, because if they didn't, the property market would be very unkind to them. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide here. The next slide this is my own drawing, by the way. I can draw with a computer here. This is my representation of a township. The United States is divided west of the Alleghenies into the most remarkable geographic configuration the world has ever seen. They simply, starting with Thomas Jefferson, sent out surveyors to lay out the entire continent in squares of 6 miles by 6 miles. This was a sales gimmick. Not a sales gimmick, it was the way they sold the land. The federal government owned all this land west of the Alleghenies, and they wanted to sell it. They wanted to get revenue. The federal government didn't have any tax sources, and at any rate, they had this big asset they were willing to sell, and so they divided up the entire country into these uniform squares, which you can see if you bother to look out the airplane window when you are crossing the country, or if you just want to get on Google Earth and look at this patchwork. It's not an accident. It came out of this survey. So the government has surveyed these squares. It's 6 miles by 6 miles. It's actually modeled on the New England township. And they divide it up into what are called sections. And they reserve, in the Land Act of 1785, they reserved the 16th section for the support of schools in the town, for the residents of the township. Now, a lot of people look at this. I've actually seen this. The Encyclopedia Britannica actually makes this error. Wikipedia doesn't quite make it, although they don't make it clear what the 16th section is really about. A lot of people look at this and say, oh, that's where they put the school. It's right in the middle of the township, after all. It looks like a sensible place to put the school. Yeah, it would be a sensible place to put a school if you had highways and school buses and things like this to travel from one place to another. It also is way too much land for a school. This is a square mile of land. It's 640 acres. Football field is an acre about. So it's way too much land for a school. This is instead an endowment. Congress set aside the 16th section of every one of these townships that they laid out, and there are hundreds of thousands of them that they laid out across. They set aside the 16th section for the support of schools in the township. That meant that the residents of the township could get income from renting the land, or conceivably later on in the century, selling the land, putting it aside in a school fund. That's how these state school funds actually got going. Put it aside in a school fund, and the money from either the rent of the land or the school fund, interest on the school fund, would be used to support schools in the township. There were many schools in these townships. The minimum number was about 9. There were as many as 25 or 30. I'll actually show you a township, not in the Middle West, but elsewhere that has these large numbers. So this is, why do I dwell on this? I said it's property owning local voters who are interested in schools. The first property owner is the federal government. Why are they promoting schools? Why are they earmarking this endowment schools? So people will buy the federal government's land. People don't want to move from Springfield, Massachusetts, or Bucks County, Pennsylvania, out into the howling wilderness of Ohio and Indiana unless there are some amenities out there. And one of the big amenities, one of the big civilizing amenities, was having a public school, or having a bunch of public schools in these various places supported at least to some extent by the federal government. So this is something, by the way, land developers do all the time. They still do it. The Celebration Florida, the big deal in Celebration Florida was they would open this, Disney would run this school to attract people. And people moved to Celebration just because of this wonderful school. I'm so glad I've got a head nodder here that says, yes, that's true, it happens. What?
It was kind of creepy when they did it.
It was kind of creepy. It had a downside because what they did was the Disney's kind of clueless about how to run a school, so they get all these education professionals who set up the most elaborate, we're going to try out all our theories of new schooling and things like this, and the people buy their homes because of this, and they get there and say, what? There's no grades, there's no curriculum, there's no this, no that. We're all going to have to get together and sing Kumbaya every day. No, that's not what they wanted. So they actually fired all the educators and went back to a standard public school that would actually be attractive to people. So the federal government is in this game. Where did they get this idea? Norwich, Vermont. I'm going to zoom in on this one because it's actually, this is a New England township. This is how the federal government got its idea of how to divide things up. Norwich, Vermont was developed by a bunch of proprietors who got a charter from Benning Wentworth. He's the governor, provincial governor of New Hampshire in the 1700s, late 1700s. And they get a charter from him, these proprietors, and the proprietors then develop the town. They are basically this is basically a land development company. And by this is Norwich, Vermont, is settled in, where did I assert here? In the 1761, same as Hanover. Wentworth was given away land right and left here. And the proprietors then divide up the land. The names on the land here, and I'll zoom in a little bit here so we can, it actually does show up here pretty well. The names on the land, well, here's like Richard Wilson, I'm not sure about that one. Clement March over here. These were proprietors. These weren't the settlers. They might have settled there, but they weren't the settlers. This was what they were entitled to then sell after the lots had been laid out in Norwich, Vermont. So this was how this land company divided up made its profits. They would divide the land actually in stages. This says first div is first division. There were actually 3 stages of dividing up the land in Norwich, perhaps because it took a while to survey it, perhaps because they're canny developers and don't want to dump all the lots on the market right at the same time, as the Disney Corporation was in Celebration. In order to make their land more marketable, one of the reasons they would allot certain, these are 100-acre parcels. They would allot certain parcels for the support of schools. This says school lot, first division, it's lot 13 in one of the ranks. That's not where the school was. That was to be sold or rented for the benefit of other settlers in the area. And this was a way of making Richard Wilborn's or William Johnson's a lot more attractive to people. Schools were a land development scheme. And it didn't start in New England, it actually preceded New England, but it was well established in New England as a way of getting a property here. It wasn't just land in New England, by the way, over here. This parcel over here is something for right for sawmill lot. There's no person named Sawmill. Sawmill is a public facility by which people can make some profits. There's another one over here for something for the Church of England. Okay, here's propagation of the gospel. This wasn't where the minister lived. This was for support of the churches. There's something for the Church of England elsewhere in the property. So giving certain parcels of land for the support of some public institution was well established in New England. Since we're at Dartmouth College, I'll point out where, oops, going the wrong way here, excuse me. Okay, Dartmouth is down here. Benning Wentworth, when he granted land, the way he actually profited from this, he essentially gave the land away for free on the condition that the proprietors would actually develop it. How did he profit then? He reserved a corner of each town that he granted for himself. Yeah, excuse me, touching up the. He reserved it for himself, and he did it in opposite corners of the townships he granted. So he held the one for Dartmouth College, which was down here, where we are right now. He held it for Dartmouth College. He wasn't giving it to Dartmouth College solely because he was a good guy and liked education. He was trying to convince other people to move to the howling wilderness of New Hampshire and what became Vermont. He thought he owned Vermont, by the way. Somebody in New York thought they did too, which is why Vermont was an independent state for a while, until they got that sorted out. So even Dartmouth College is part of this land development scheme of schools. It was one of the devices. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. This is actually my favorite slide. And I'll try and get it. This is Middlebury, Vermont in 1870. One of the few examples where the district schools are actually indicated, and the site for the schools, as well as the names of everybody else, is really a cadastral map for tax purposes, are an example of it. And so you can see how this Middlebury, Vermont is about the same size as a standard township. It's basically 6 miles by 6 miles. It's actually a little bit bigger, but they weren't so great at surveying sometimes. So Middlebury divided itself up pretty much spontaneously into separate school districts. So we have district number 3, indicated over here, actually. We have district number 3, and it's got a school. Actually, I'm not sure I can, let me zoom in. I'll zoom in on the lower ones because it's actually a little more visible. This shows up. This is from a site, the Middlebury College Library, by the way, in case I should give a copyright. I think I use this by permission in my book. So here's district number 1. They pretty much just ordered them in their order of establishment. And in the middle of district number 1, there it is, school number 1. District number 2 is over here. There's another school. These schools were town institutions, but there were also local institutions. The districts got revenue from the state of Vermont, from the town of Middlebury, and from raising their own taxes, and in many cases, earlier in the century, by charging tuition. On what were called rate bills, they would actually collect, through the property tax system, revenue from people who patronize the schools. Now, children were so common back there, almost every family had children, that the rate bill was almost like a tax bill. It was actually a convenient way to collect, so it's not a whole lot different from this. These are small enough that kids can actually walk to work, walk to the school from home, because transportation isn't very good. But here's what I find interesting about this Middlebury map, and this is not an uncommon thing. Here's district number 1, here's district number 2, here's district number 13, one of the very late numbered districts. It was clearly established later than districts 1 and 2. What they almost surely did, I don't have the goods on this, is district number 13 was carved out from district number 1 and district number 2. When population grew in most towns that had district schools, they would establish, instead of establishing a bigger school and having a multi-graded school, they'd do another one-room school. Why would they do that instead of they did it because children had to work on the farm as well, and so having a school close to the farmstead was a real asset for the farmers. If a kid had to walk 2 miles to school, A, he's not there to help milk the cows, and B, he's tired when he comes back. So you really like to have the school close to him. And for that reason, a lot of these schools were on donated land. And in fact, there were kind of fights about, no, my land, no, your land, no, not your land, my land, because and the center of the school would be the school district. So Middlebury, this is up to 1870, is divided, like every other New England town, into at least 13 districts. There's actually some unnumbered districts. I think they're unnumbered because they're actually spill into another town, and the kids go to school actually in another town. They didn't respect the town boundaries very much until school consolidation later in the story. Okay, this is my technology story. You always wish technology was that easy, but it's actually quite subtle. It's very rare to find pictures. I haven't seen a photograph yet. They're just artistic representations of how instruction was actually done in one-room schools. But it's really done differently than it is in a modern graded schools. This is a school, this is from a book in 1874, but it's a story of looking backward. They're nostalgic for their old schools, so it's set in like 1820 or so. By Edward Eggleston, who was known for his realistic depiction of rural life in Indiana, of what I call a recitation group, what everybody calls a recitation group. Here's the school marm, and here are the 3 children who have previously sat in the back, like these guys in the back here, and read their lesson that the teacher had assigned to them, and now they are reciting for her from they take their turn to come and recite. The recitation, the reciting is based, for the most part, just repeating from memory. You had to memorize your lesson and repeat. And if you did, the teacher would beat you or humiliate you. And if she didn't, by the way, the school, the parents of the children might object that if you were too soft on the kids, because this was a harsh age. This was not, it's easy to sort of make fun of this and say, or disparage it by saying, oh, these are terrible conditions. Conditions at home were pretty much the same. They did not live in nice houses. They worked from dawn to dusk. So having a school that was a log cabin like this was a very early school was not all that unusual. The other thing I want you to notice is that these children are not of the same age. There isn't any age grading here. There is simply grading, there is simply recitation groups formed by previous accomplishment, basically on how far you got in your previous reader or your speller or your arithmetic book, how much of it you had memorized. The teacher at the beginning, and maybe she's doing this, at the beginning of the term, would ask people how far they'd gotten in their readers, put people, if she had more than a few children, which very often she had a lot, 50 was not at all unusual to have enrollment in a school like this, would put them in a group based on previous accomplishment. So the girl's clearly younger than the boys, and this is for a perfectly good reason. The girl is probably attending school more regularly because she doesn't have to work on the farm as much as the boys do. So the boys, I'm going to jump ahead here to one slide here. This is the school term for the 19th century. There's this wonderful myth. I used to be at cocktail party bore about this, asking people about, why do we have summer vacation? They said, oh, it's because the kids had to work on the farm in the summer. Think about farming, will you? Planting is when you need kids. Harvest is when you need kids. Summer is when you watch the crops grow, and so that's when the kids go to school. Kids go to school in the summer and in the winter. Now, the older boys would in fact plant, help milk the cows and work in the field and do the haying and also help harvest. So older boys generally above age 10, would in fact work, not go to school in the summer. They'd only go to school in the winter. Girls who didn't work in the field could go in the school in both the summer and the winter. And so girls actually tended to get through their textbook. That was what graduation meant. You ran out of textbook material to memorize. You would get through your textbook, and then you could get on with your life. Getting on with your life very often meant, at age 15, turning around and teaching in the school you were at. Laura Ingalls Wilder did that. She was not unusual. At age 15, she had a common school education. She'd gotten through it, and so she went and taught school for a few terms. The terms were irregular. It's like school in session. It might be 2 months, it might be 3 months, it might be 4 months. It actually, given the technology that they had, it didn't matter how long it was. You always got a positive increment by going to school. You didn't have to start, if you were like Abraham Lincoln and you missed several years of school, or you came to school only irregularly, in a graded school system, he'd just have to repeat the grade all the time. But in this system, whenever Lincoln could spare some time to go to school, he could pick up in his old reader where he left off and learn incrementally. So this was an efficient technology, I argue, for learning the rudiments without having to start over from grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. Nobody failed any grades here because there were no grades to fail. You just kept marching through your common school curriculum, the school books, whenever you could do it. And because children were necessary to keep a farm operating, I argue this was an efficient system. Efficient not in the sense that you'll get the maximum amount of education, but efficient in terms of a society that needs its children to work on the farm and at the same time wants to acquire literacy and numeracy and the ability to write and do a little bit of maybe geography and history, but not much. That was the payoff. You could run a business doing that. Lincoln learned enough to become a surveyor and lawyer and all that, with subsequent study, of course. The schools were actually fairly efficient in doing that. So I'm back here in Middlebury. I want to go to the next slide. Okay. So that's the story here. So this young woman is probably 17 or 18 years old, maybe. One of the things about these school districts, by the way, is that the one-room schools liked turnover. They did not want teachers to stay very long. Now you can say, well, that was minimizing cost. But think about being in a one-room school. If you're actually one of these kids here and you're going to the same school, not continuously, but 1 year after the next, you don't want to see the same teacher all the time, because you might not get along with that particular teacher. So my view is turnover was actually a way of, when you're in a graded school and you go from grade 1 to grade 2, you usually don't have the same teacher in grade 2 and grade 3. You change teachers. Here's the teacher has to change. So that's why they actually liked one room, relatively short tenures. And so being an educator, actually they didn't call them educators, you kept school. You didn't teach school. You kept school. And because what you were doing essentially was supervising recitation groups. You didn't actually teach them. You told them to read this and then memorize it and read it back to me. was what keeping school actually amounted to. So it was a relatively brief occupation. This woman, I'm guessing, well, it's a fictional person, of course, would get married and then stop teaching school. You couldn't be married and teach school at the same time. Some people say that's gender discrimination. No, they hired unmarried women all the time. Why didn't they like married women? Because being a farm wife was a full-time job. You could not serve two masters, literally. You couldn't both be a farm wife who you did not have electric dryers and washers and stoves. You had to do a lot of heavy work. And so really it was impossible for married women to teach school. And so school directors actually, the local school board would sometimes make the teacher promise not to get married during the term, because essentially meant that she was taking another job, which would take all of her time. Okay. Here's my story about the switch to graded education. I pointed out that people in school districts were self-governing institutions. They're the most democratic institution we ever had. You knew the school director, you selected it from the members of your school district, and you could attend the school meeting. You could show up in the school too. Not that they did a whole lot, because many of them actually hadn't gone through much school themselves. Nonetheless, they knew that not having a school was a bad thing. It was bad for their property values, it was bad for their kids if they had kids, but even if they didn't have kids, not having a school. So that's how we got about, I'm guessing, 250,000 schools by the end of the 19th century. They were established by local people. It wasn't the legislature that created them. Most of these schools were established before, at least in the upper Midwest, in the territories that were first laid out and sold by the federal government. Most of these schools were established in advance of any legislation authorizing them. So I read accounts of a school teacher who was in Kansas, a young woman, who wanted to teach school, but she actually didn't have any school district. There wasn't enough, the property records had not been established to get any money from the school section, the 16th section yet. And so she set up her own school in anticipation of getting the money later on. So the school districts were really grounds, everybody agrees on this, that the initial ones were from the bottom up accounts. How did they segue then into this system that we now have? Remember I showed you the previous one of 19th century rural schools had winter and summer terms, more or less. Sometimes they'd miss a term, no big deal, because you just did your thing until you could go to a regular school. There's actually a wonderful story that I stumbled upon by W.E.B. Du Bois, the black leader of the early 20th century, how on a school vacation from his college days, he went out into the hinterland and looked for a school and finally found one and set up school and taught for a couple months. It was a black school, of course, W.B. as was necessary in his case. So these were very local institutions, very much run by the people who both worked in them, and they had very catch as catch can kind of schedule. When we think of a real school now, of course, here we are in a school year where we have a summer vacation, and we start school at the end of summer, we have some vacations in between, but we end the school year here. This is one of the markers of standardization of schools. That schools, yes, I understand people have to go. You will not offend me by leaving if that's but there's good stories afterwards. School's in session here. Here's what I thought was the interesting question of how did we get into this standardized section which if you have a graded school, it's really a good idea if you're going to move from one place to another, and we are a mobile society, we move a lot, even when our kids are in school, it's really a good idea to start at the beginning of the school year. It's both good for the kid and it's good for the teacher and the other kids in the class, because if you show up in November or December, it's really a nuisance for the teacher to bring you up to speed. You got to neglect the other kids. Really a good idea. So what I argue with summer vacation is it's a good time to move. And in fact, most families with kids do move sometime during the summer, or wait for summer to move, and have this schedule of beginning here and ending there. Well, how did we get into this was my question. That was one of my initial questions of if summer vacation isn't about kids working on the farms, because kids went to school in the summer, the farmers' kids went to school in the summer, I'm sure it's not about working on the farm. How did we get into this sort of coordination schedule? I maintain, and here I am speculating, but I actually have some basis for this speculation. I maintain that this was an example of what social scientists in other contexts will sometimes call spontaneous order. It happened without anybody actually thinking very hard about it. Now, here's my one example of it. I go over to Baker Library and dig up some old stuff about the New Hampshire reports from the superintendent of schools from 1880, and discover that they actually have in 1880 listing the high schools of New Hampshire. There's about 30 of them in towns of any size. Not all towns have high schools, and high schools are really not big schools. They're not even separate. Mostly the one in Hanover was just an adjunct of the regular school. Schools are held in winter and summer. The common schools are held in winter and summer. The high schools, on the other hand, require a more professional teacher corps. You got to know a little more than just having gone to the common schools. And so you would want to have some high school education, maybe even a little bit of college to teach high school. For that reason alone, not just mobility, you want to have all school districts working on the same schedule. Because think about being a teacher. If you're a school teacher in Japan, for example, in Japan, the school year starts in April, on April 1st. And it ends sometime in February, late February. Okay? The rest of the world doesn't do it that way. The Japanese like to do it their own way. Now, it's partly because the rest of the world does not partake of Japanese education and vice versa. It's a very unusual, highly demanding system where people generally don't want to leave it. The rest of the world is pretty much on this schedule. How did they come at it? Almost no discussion whatsoever. I find the records in New Hampshire, however, in which they reveal the starting of the school year. And of the, I think, about 40 high schools are listed. 10 or 11 of them don't start in August or September. They start in April. This is 1880. One of those non-standard Japanese-style calendars is Hanover, New Hampshire. So I rub my hands, oh, I can get the records there. And I find in 1883, the Hanover School Board votes to end the school year in June and start it in September. And I thought, oh, great, there's got to be discussion. This must have been really a controversial issue. Not. Nobody discusses it. Why would they have done that? So I have to supply my own reasons. 10 other school districts did that in that period. By 1900, they're all on the same schedule. Why are they doing that? Hanover and Manchester actually started in January, would have two problems, at least two problems from starting in the non-standard school years. One is they'd have a hard time hiring teachers, because the teachers who are working now a full year are ending in June after you've started your school year. Even if you can find a local teacher and you're going to end your school year in February or something like that, she's going to wonder, can I really get a job somewhere else if I'm looking in the middle of their school year? So it really pays for coordination purposes for everybody to get on the same schedule. And indeed, they do get on the same schedule. So the school year is an example of a kind of spontaneous order. The state did not order them to start in September and end in June. They simply all found it in their interest and they would be disciplined by not being able to hire teachers, or in the case of families moving from one place to another, you move into Hanover in September and you discover the high school is one-third over. You can't start at the beginning. So it really pays for everybody to be coordinated. When you have a graded system, when you're going from grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you have an ungraded system, you don't have to do that. You can do school whenever it's handy to do school, whenever the kids aren't needed on the farm for harvesting and planting and other stuff. It's quite easy to do it in that case. Here's my clincher, by the way, on the school system. This is, as I said, this is a worldwide standard, except for Japan and Korea, which basically has Japan's system because the Japanese occupied it for many years. So Japan and Korea have this April start. The rest of the world starts at the end of summer, starts the school year at the end of summer, and ends at the beginning of next summer, just like almost everywhere else. There are some equatorial exceptions where where the seasons don't matter very much. Bruce Sacerdote actually gave me the cue on this. And I said, how do I know this is a coordinating device? And Bruce said, well, why don't you look at the southern hemisphere? Whoa, yeah, we got a really natural experiment called the equator that has the seasons reversed. So the end of summer is like February. And indeed, that's when South Africa and Australia and South America start their school year. Now, what does that prove? Not much. Here's what I think is the clincher, at least with the most impressive piece of evidence in my mind. There are things called international schools, where you go to an international, you're a business person or you're a diplomat and you're assigned for several years to another country. And I'll use the American example, although there are British international schools, there are Australian international schools. You go and you take your kids and they'll essentially provide the curriculum of your home country. So that when you go back to the States or you go back to London, you can essentially, your kids can pick up on the regular 5th grade or 7th grade curriculum or whatever they have. These international schools, in other words, want to imitate the host country. International schools in the southern hemisphere keep the northern hemisphere calendar. They start in September, not in February, unlike their host countries. So there's an American international school in Johannesburg, South Africa, or in Buenos Aires, which caters to visiting Americans and other people who want an American-style school system, right next to other schools that are operating on a completely different calendar. Why? Some of them are actually explicit about this. They need to coordinate they tell people, you'll be able to go back, when you go back home, you'll be able to go back into school without having to wait for 6 months for school to start, and so forth. So that's my kicker. That's why I think I'm pretty sure it's a coordinating device. The most impressive part about this is that this coordinating device, very important coordinating device, happened without almost any discussion at all. I really call it a kind of spontaneous order. It's spontaneous, the spontaneity of it was affirmed to me by a paper I discovered after I wrote a paper about this. I wrote a paper titled for a popular song, "Will I See You in September?" Indicating that that's the traditional start of the school, although it's actually mostly August now. The paper addressed the question of German schools. Before World War II, Germany started school kind of like Japan does. They started in April and they had a summer vacation. Japanese have a summer vacation, but that's basically a trimester break. And that's what the German schools did. World War II comes and Germany occupies a lot of other countries in Europe. Amazingly enough, the Germans say, oh, we need a standardized school system. The Nazis say this. They force Germany onto the school calendar of everybody else. And so they start in September. After the war, perhaps in reaction to Hitler and things like this, the schools of Germany, which are run by the Land, the states basically, the local Land, most of them went back to their April beginning. Although some of them, most notably Bavaria, stayed on the September beginning. So now they're uncoordinated. It's really hard to move from Bavaria to Baden-Württemberg in some other province. And so what happens? Do the local school districts suddenly, like Hanover, get religion? No, there's no really local school districts. They're controlled by the state. So the states have to, in 1965, have a confab in Hamburg. It's called the Hamburg Abkommen. I actually read a little bit of German. And the agreement is that they will all start in September. The Swiss have to go through the same rigmarole. The German provinces are different from the French-speaking provinces. And so the Swiss, being the Swiss, actually have a constitutional amendment saying when school has to start. I think it's the only constitution in the world that dictates the school year. But they had to do this to get them all in line. It was not a spontaneous order because there isn't much local control. There's no property owner who says, you know, we're out of line here and nobody wants to buy my property, or I'm having sales resistance, or I can't get employees to move here because of the difficulty of coordinating the school year. So they have to have a high level. There, the supply side story matters. I'm going to give you one more piece of evidence for the supply side, for the demand side, I should say. This is Iowa counties. And I like Iowa counties because they're kind of squarish looking. Iowa's laid out in the townships. These aren't townships, these are counties, so there's a bunch of counties in each of these, a bunch of townships in each of these counties. And here's my evidence. Around the 1930s, one-room schools are starting to consolidate. And the state government has always wanted them to consolidate. But by the 1930s, the school districts are starting to consolidate. The people are realizing that they want, but the consolidation is sort of disorderly. One district, one of the one-room school districts will join with 3 others and they'll form a graded school, or maybe 8 of them will get together so they can run a high school together and build a new school. But there might be a holdout somewhere. And so the state tries to coordinate the consolidation of these one-room schools. They get a state commission, and this happened not just in Iowa, it happened all over the place. I have a number of sources that indicate this happened in New York, this happened in lots of other states. The states get a commission together and says, oh, we know how to do this. Let's have the county be the school district. And so in state after state, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, state commissions said, let's have the county or some other pre-existing local government be the school district. That would be a rational way of administering the school as far as we're concerned up here in the state government. Okay? Here's what they got for their troubles. These are Iowa school districts in 2000. You can't see the county lines there, or barely see the county lines. The voters would have none of this county business. They wanted to preserve their school district and consolidate with other school districts with which they had something in common. And so the state proposes the counties, the voters say no way, both at the legislative level. Remember, the legislatures are overweighted towards rural counties before 1960s, before the one person, one vote rule. So these rural, it's not like the cities are forcing the rurals to do anything. The rural's really calling the shots for their school districts. And these school districts, these tiny little one-room school districts, are municipal corporations, and they have some rights. You can't just put them out of business without some special legislation or with their permission. They realize they've got to get permission. How are they going to do this? They won't go the county way. What they do, and there's actually good records of this, what they do is they form commissions within a county to divide the county into school districts that are, quote, organic communities. They use this term time and time again, the organic community. And to identify the organic community, they'll send people out to find out who's doing what. It's sort of like the Census Bureau setting up metropolitan areas, except in really small ways. And to make sure that the locals don't feel manipulated, they'll put these in charge of these local committees people who have nothing to do with the state schools. They're politically savvy enough to realize you've got to get the voters convinced. Once they do this and the voters are convinced that they're actually joining with other districts that they have something in common with, then they'll vote to consolidate. They'll vote to get rid of their one-room school. They want to have a multi-grade school because they can't get their kids to high school from these one-room schools. The one-room school is great for teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. When you got to teach 5 subjects to 8 grades, that's 40 recitation groups per day. That works out to about 8.5 minutes per recitation group in a 5-hour day. It just isn't enough time to do it. And so the one-room schools that persisted actually grouped students anyway, even though they were nominally graded. The 6th and 7th and 8th graders would have geography together, which is, I mean, sounds nice, and in many ways it was nice, but it meant for the 8th grader you were seeing a lot of old material. You were not advancing your education very much. And so the one-room schools didn't do the job for getting into high school. And so the voters realized this. The state coordinates this essentially by asking the voters, what do you think is a logical consolidated school district? And that's how Iowa comes up with this jigsaw puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle persists all over the country except in the South or in the very arid West where the county starts to become the boundary because there's just not enough kids to form a to form a high school in the early part of the 20th century. So that's pretty much my story, that this is a bottom-up process. I think it's a logical process, but it's one that doesn't have any central controllers, somebody who says you do this and you do that. There are people who say you do this and you do that, but nobody pays any attention to them until they realize that there's some payoff. So that's the summary I have, and I'll entertain questions for the woman in the back.
So moving forward, for any of us that are looking to get into education, whether it be on the policy side or administration or as educators, do you think the takeaway here is that we should be, the takeaway is that we should be sort of leveraging this demand side idea to kind of build consensus and buy-in to look for fundamental structural change? Is that?
That is, yes.
Okay.
I would happily leave that as my own conclusion, but that's right. I think a lot of education reform is misguided in the sense that they don't take school districts seriously. One thing about school districts, though, is that a lot of this, what looks like state rules, are rules that the local districts want to do because they want to have a fifth grade curriculum and a 5th grade activities that segue from 4th grade anywhere in the country. Because if they have a 5th grade that is truly unique, I mean, it might even be a lot better than 5th grade curriculum elsewhere. If it's really unique and builds on some other skills that were unique to that school, people coming in from outside are going to say, what do I do here? You've got this really strange school. I actually don't want to buy a house. It's sort of like the Celebration Florida story. You have this really odd school that doesn't build on my kid's previous knowledge and won't provide knowledge in case I move away again. We move a lot. So this standardization promotes mobility. So what looks kind of like, oh, the state made this 5th grade curriculum to be uniform. Actually, the 5th grade curriculum, the uniformity of 5th grade curriculum or X grade curriculum is quite remarkable. I mean, you can move from one grade to another. And it actually started, European observers were impressed with it back in the 1930s. It's really because it's in the interest of the district to be not too different from other places. The downside of that, I know I'm answering much more than this question here, the downside of that is if you have a really good idea for how to make 5th grade better, for how to make it, you've got a problem. If your 5th graders can do 2 grades in 1 year, that's actually going to be a problem for both the kids and people coming into 6th grade in your school district. So this interchangeability that I talk about, this sort of loose interchangeability, actually puts something of a ceiling on education reform. So it's not all, it's not all lovely here. Graded schooling does have a kind of grim logic to it. Other questions, observations? Yes. She wants to give you a mic. We're going to work Sarah hard here.
Do you think advances in transportation technology like cars and buses also played a significant role in the consolidation?
Of course they did. Yes, they did. the school bus was Henry Ford made it possible to have these consolidated schools. The value added I have of my observation here, and everybody sort of recognizes that transportation was a big deal. The value added I think I have of this is you could have had transportation to a one-room school. In other words, you could have kept a lot of this one-room schooling and just had a larger school district. So there's this change in technology of age-graded schools from the one-room, the recitation group story, into the first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade story that is the pedagogical, the technology of school difference here. But yeah, you certainly needed that. The other thing that changed a lot was changing when the one-room school was essentially starting to go out of business is rural depopulation. The farms are getting much larger. They're getting mechanized. Henry Ford had something to do with that too. And they don't need as many children. And so they have fewer children and they don't have to work on the farm. And so the rural population density gets much lower. So the ability to have a one-room school and just walk to the one-room school is actually starting to diminish. My contribution here is why did they change the technology from the one-room to the age-graded school, and how did they actually do it? They changed it because they needed to get into high school. And the way they did it was essentially they discovered that for themselves that not having an age-graded school and a high school and the entree to high school was really bad for your property values.
I think it's a really interesting talk, and two things that I'm taking away from it about it are how local voters and local funding are really driving a lot of the development and the economic evolution of schools.
That's correct.
So I guess, and maybe this is a little bit of a hot potato, but it seems to me that there might be some implications, especially if we're looking at a state like New Hampshire, where you've got some tensions where there's been a big push in the last 10 or 15 years for changing the funding source for local education from local to state. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about these tensions and what the implications are for this type of system moving to state funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think local control is a desirable thing, but you don't have to have, to put it in economic terms, you need to have the voter think that the local property tax, or whatever the local tax is, it's almost always the local property tax, will actually buy you something. Because if it doesn't buy you something in terms of a better school, we need to hire a music teacher, is that good? Remember, in almost all communities, people with kids in school are a minority of the voting population. So you want to convince other people that it's a good idea to raise your taxes so you can hire a music teacher, build another wing on the school, or whatever. And if you have that feedback, you're more likely to get people on board with that. Having said that, I brought up this other picture here. School finance inequality is a problem. And I go back to this 16th section. The 16th section was arbitrarily chosen. We just have to come up with a number to donate. And actually, as the century wore on and states were incorporated in the arid parts, they started giving the 16th and the 32nd and maybe the 30th because the land wasn't all that valuable. The 16th section actually didn't provide that much funding. But the 16th section, because it's quite arbitrary, you could have neighboring townships, some of which had a really fertile 16th section that would generate lots of rents or could be sold for a lot of money, and the township right next to it would have just nothing. The 16th section could be a near desert. Sometimes Congress would fix that if it was really that bad. But most of the time, there's an enormous amount of school finance inequality from the very get-go. The state government's worried properly about that one place could fund a lot of schools and another place could not fund, couldn't really fund very well at all. And if you start to think about schools being interchangeable, this interchangeability, it's actually in your interest for other schools to be kind of like yours and kind of as well-funded as yours, because you want children coming from that district to your district to have kind of the same skills, not to mention, you know, adult life experience that you'd like to have opportunities for. So there's a real tension between, and I don't think you can eliminate this tension, between you want schools, you want the local voters to pay attention to the quality of the schools, and the property tax and property values are really a good feedback mechanism. But you don't want it to be the exclusive mechanism, because there are some places that just don't have any property tax base. They're either poor, or they're in poor areas or declining areas, or whatever. So what I see as the tension between this and what's happening in New Hampshire and happening in a lot of places is that there is some political tension, a necessary tension, between local funding and state funding. My own conclusion is you need some of both. You don't want to eliminate either one, though, is the way. At some margin, though, you do want some local control. The other thing I'd add about local control, by the way, I once heard a story about, this is actually a fairly common problem. India has rural schools that have kind of one-room schools. India has a problem that I never ever heard about in the United States history. Sometimes in India, the local teacher will simply not show up. So the teacher plays hooky. This never happened in American schools. Why does a teacher get away with playing hooky? Because he or she is an employee of a very distant state government which cannot monitor what's going on. And in fact, there are little economists have come up with some ideas of have the kids take pictures of the school with a date on it or something like that, so they can actually discipline teachers who don't show up. Never happened in an American rural school district. Teacher didn't show up, the tax-paying parents and the school board knew about it within hours, and he would be docked a day's pay. This is taken to the extreme, by the way, in the early part of the century, that if he called a holiday on Christmas Day, he wouldn't be paid. Now, he very often did, sometimes on threat of rebellion by the students, but it was his gift to the teacher, or her gift to the students, because he didn't get paid that day. Paid holiday is not something that anybody actually had early in the 19th century. I'm not talking about school teachers generally. But so local control, local fiscal control really does matter at a very elementary level, elemental level, I guess, for this. So I think it's a big deal. I would not give up on the school district, even though it is a source of inequality that we should quite properly worry about.
I'm just going to say, you know, in light of what you said, in light of what you said, how do you justify the increasing resegregation in American schools, the increasing phenomenon of black schools becoming blacker, white schools becoming whiter, white flight out of the major cities, and so the inner cities that are mainly minorities are more and more troubled and not assisted by the presence of slightly wealthier people who've taken to the suburbs. You know, if you look at comparatively and you look at places like Britain or Canada, where you see that their funding is done very differently, there seems greater equality, and we all know that the gap in this country between very rich and very poor is the largest in the developed world. So how do you reconcile your advocacy for local control with that? Because we like to govern ourselves, I think we have a spirit of self-government, not through the state, and that's actually how you get people interested in the schools. I'm going to give an answer that's a little bit oblique to what you're saying, but I think nonetheless speaks to it a little bit. There are some studies, there are some states where basically there's no more local fiscal control. People still like their school district for one reason or another, you know, social capital and so forth, but California, basically the state money goes by student, period. So California has a very egalitarian system. It's actually really hard to get people who do not have children in schools interested in funding schools. And so California's, at least on one analysis, California's schools are much more poorly funded on average because there's no more connection between what the local voters see as the benefit of schools. Everything, all the money comes from Sacramento. So California is kind of my counter example of
That's really an egalitarian system, and it's the result of a court case, not as the result of ordinary politics. The Serrano case, essentially, Serrano and Prop 13 result in this highly egalitarian system in California for school funding. And most people, most economists who look at this say, that's actually a problem. Some local funding, if you had some local funding, not complete local funding, nobody's advocating that, some local funding would actually make California voters willing to pay more for their public schools. So that's kind of my answer to that. I would also point out that in terms of the finances, if you look at where poor people actually live in urban areas, they do not have as much spending per pupil as the very richest suburbs, but they actually spend more than the average suburb, so that it isn't clear that state funding would benefit these big cities. The model here is Michigan, which went to a state funding, a highly egalitarian system, and Detroit lost out. Detroit actually had lots of non-residential property and a relatively small school population for obvious kind of reasons. And so, but their schools are actually getting less funding as a result of statewide equalization. So it isn't obvious that the numbers even work out all the way. That's my response. I know it doesn't speak to the black-white gap. I don't have any good answers on that. I think last question, if there is a last question. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Last microphone.
Less profound than Andrew's, but a quick question, Bill, about your slide about the school year. So if we're getting places like the KIPP schools, for instance, advocating more of a year-round kind of schooling, then do you see that as a top-down model? And if so, does that mean that the year-round schooling will be destined in most communities not to be adopted?
The latter is true. It is whatever model. There actually is. There's an association for year-round schooling. It promotes year-round schooling, and there are districts that try it. And lots of economists, I get this from economists, will look at the summer vacation and say, sort of like the Grinch. The economist as Grinch would say, why aren't we using this public capital? We could have staggered, we wouldn't have to have a longer school year, but we could have some people start in summer, some in fall, and we could use the school plan 25% more efficiently. There are districts that do it, that are rapidly growing. They're actually often in California. They're rapidly growing from immigration, and they are fiscally constrained. They can't build schools fast enough, so they do year-round operation. Everybody hates it. Part of the Williams versus school suit in California, the last school finance suit that was settled out of court, one of the complaints was, we have to do year-round schools. It's really unfair. The guys out there in the suburbs can start in the fall. It's very unpopular. And it does not batch well. If you finished your school year in January, as one of those 4 tracks would do, and you move to Colorado, and Colorado has a fairly standard school year, what are your kids going to do? Drop it in the middle of 3rd grade? Or wait till September to start 3rd grade? Or what? It's kind of like changing hemispheres, south to north. So I think it is a loser. I think it is adopted strictly from Hungary, and I would predict it will not happen because it doesn't coordinate. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your patience. I'll be happy to hang around if people want to talk. I'm